After careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
The United States deemed Syria strategically important to its presence in the Middle East. So when the Civil War began in 2011, it was in its best interest to stop the war. One of the motives for U.S. involvement was the presence of several oil fields in Syria. This was shown in an article by the New York Times, where the U.S. forces focused on protecting oil fields in Syria even after the troops had pulled out in October of 2019 and then were redeployed a month later. The strategic resource of oil was not the only reason for the intervention, and the issue can be tied to the greater potential effects of the Civil War on U.S. influence in the Middle East. As stated by the U.S. options in Syria, a report from the Defense Technical Information Center from the United States government, the U.S. sought to contain the conflict from leaving the borders of Syria. The U.S. also tried to amend the age-old divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims by trying to quell the conflict, as one of the motives behind the conflict was the schism. The method of restricting the overall effects of the war and confining the conflict itself is not too unlike the military strategy of containment deployed in Vietnam. In fact, this report goes on to say how this was a primary strategy during the Cold War. This document also notes, though, that the deployment of this procedure and the overall involvement of the U.S. in the Syrian civil war could end up escalating the conflict further. This did not stop the United States from taking a role within Syria, as new rivals rose within the war to oppose the U.S.'s influence over the Middle East. One of the biggest reasons the United States became involved in the war was Russia's backing of the Assad regime. Considering Russia was openly supporting Assad, it was a major factor for the U.S. involvement as the government wanted to halt the influence of Russia in the Middle East. This led to the United States indirectly backing rebels against Assad with military logistics and weapons. The back and forth between U.S. and Russia players would operate as a kind of pseudo-war between the two superpowers. The rise of ISIS within Syria implicated the U.S. to call upon an ethnic group they both supported and ignored for the past few decades, the Kurds. The U.S., while still backing the rebels to push back against the regime, trained and provided armaments for the Kurds to strip the territory ISIS had gained amidst the chaos of the Civil War. The level of U.S. involvement in the war led to no comprehensible changes to the conflict. ISIS would be pushed out of Syria, but the fighting between Assad and the rebels was giving no benefit to the U.S. By the time the Trump administration would take control of U.S. involvement in the war, it appeared as if no one knew what would happen next. Obama had been originally cautious in explicitly involving the U.S. in the war, at least directly, and Trump was not any different. As of 2017, as stated in an article by the NPR, the media and general public felt as if the conflict was going nowhere.
The conflict in Syria is an incredibly complex and multifaceted situation, but this is reminiscent of another conflict in American history, the Vietnam War. U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in 1955, and we remained involved until 1973. The United States attempted to portray our time in the Vietnam War as a righteous battle for democracy and freedom around the world.
But I had a greater obligation than to think only of the years of my administration and of the next election. I had to think of the effect of my decision on the next generation and on the future of peace and freedom in America and in the world.
Despite this attempt, U.S. citizens eventually became fatigued with the war and developed what was later called Vietnam Syndrome. Vietnam Syndrome is the fatigue many Americans developed surrounding U.S. intervention in Third World conflicts and a desire to seek out peaceful and practical solutions to issues. Vietnam Syndrome manifested in the restriction of U.S. military and intelligence powers and the abolition of conscription. While many Americans shared these sentiments, some Americans pushed back against this change of policy. Business, military, and intelligence leaders argued that lack of U.S. involvement would only incite more challenge from other foreign powers, particularly Russia. and that we needed to stay involved in global affairs to show our resolve. A quote from the magazine Business Week in 1979 summarized these sentiments of remaining strong and economically competitive on the global scale, shared by those in favor of continued U.S. involvement.
At the end of the war, it was estimated that as many as 2 million Vietnamese citizens, both North and South, 1.1 million North Vietnamese soldiers, and between 200 to 250 South Vietnamese soldiers all perished during the Vietnam War. In addition, 3 million Vietnamese were wounded, and another 12 million became refugees. The end of the war may have ended the physical fighting, but it did not end in peace, especially for the Southern Vietnamese. After the war and subsequent reunification of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and the new communist government constructed labor camps, in which they would send Southern Vietnamese to complete hard labor tasks for, quote, re-education. The impacts of the war on civilians and the country of Vietnam were long-lasting and very difficult to overcome. During the war, the U.S. had sprayed 18 million gallons of herbicides, which contain toxic chemicals, across around 6 million acres, which roughly equates to 1/7 of Vietnamese land. And it contains a, quote, much higher proportion of the most fertile cropland and richest forests, end quote, according to James William Gibson in his book, The Perfect War, The War We Couldn't Lose and How We Did. He goes on to say that, quote, an additional 1,200 square miles of territory were bulldozed flat, stripped of all life, end quote. At the war's end, Vietnam was left as one of the world's poorest countries, and it took years for the country to rebuild itself, even to come close to what it had been before. However, this war had impacts on the American people as well. By the conclusion of the war, the American public was left mourning for the deaths of the 58,220 American soldiers who died while fighting in Vietnam. Also, this was a huge turning point in terms of the trust in the government from the perspective of the American citizens. Americans were constantly being told that the war efforts were going well and that the soldiers would return home soon. However, the rising popularity of the television in the 1960s and 1970s played a key role in showing the American people the truth about what was happening in Vietnam. To make matters worse, the American economy took a huge hit after Vietnam. According to History.com editors in the article entitled Vietnam War, quote, the nation spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. This massive spending led to widespread inflation, exacerbated by the worldwide oil crisis in 1973 and skyrocketing fuel prices, end quote. These economic impacts forever changed the American economy. We learned from Vietnam that we need to be extremely careful with what conflicts we choose to get involved with. It has been almost 50 years since the end of the war. Has it been so long that Vietnam has lost its impact on American foreign policy? Is this why we're repeating ourselves? Has it been so long that these impacts mean nothing anymore? Will we look back on Syria and have the same remorse and loss that we had from Vietnam? Will we look back on ourselves and say, why didn't we learn the first time?